The temperature that night was 17 degrees, and the wind off the Allegheny was doing that thing where it finds every gap in the building. I was on the front desk from 10 to 6, which was normal for me back then, and we were full. 42 beds, 42 people, plus a couple of guys we'd let sleep on the folding chairs in the intake room because turning anyone away in December is not something you do if you can help it. I'd been working the shelter on the north side for about 8 months at that point. I'm not going to pretend I was some kind of expert. Most of the job was signing people in, handing out towels, making sure nobody was drinking in the bathroom. The rest was just being there. That's what a night shift is. You sit at a desk and you're a presence in the room, and when somebody wakes up crying, you get them a cup of water, and you don't ask about it unless they want you to. Around 11, 2 people came in through the front door. Not together, not obviously. The man walked in first and stood by the community board, reading it like he was interested. Maybe 30 seconds later, the woman came in behind him. She was carrying a clipboard. That was the first thing. Volunteers don't bring their own clipboards. We have clipboards. If you're from a partner organization, an outreach team, a nurse doing check-ins, you sign in at my desk and we hand you one of ours with the visitor log clipped to the top. It's a small thing, but when someone walks into a place they've never been and already has a clipboard, they're performing being official. The man was maybe 40. Dark jacket, dark jeans, boots that looked new, clean-shaven. The woman was younger, maybe late 20s, wearing one of those puffer coats that everybody had that winter. She smiled at me from across the room and lifted the clipboard like she was going to bring it over, then didn't. She drifted toward the common area, where a bunch of the guys were watching a Steelers rerun on the TV in the corner. I called out, "Hey, you need to sign in over here." She said, "1 second, sweetie. I just want to say hi to somebody." Sweetie. That's the other thing I remember. I'm 31, and I've been called a lot of things by a lot of people at that desk, but staff and outreach workers don't call you sweetie. It's the wrong register. I got up. My supervisor, Renee, was in the back office doing intake paperwork, and I could hear her stapling something. The overhead fluorescents in the common area were the yellow kind that made everyone look a little sick, and the whole room smelled like the dinner we'd served at 7, which was chili and cornbread and coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. I walked over. The man was talking to a resident I'll call Terrence. Terrence had been with us on and off for a year. Good guy, quiet, dealing with some stuff. The man was leaning in a little, one hand on the back of a chair, and I caught the tail end of what he was saying as I got close. Just one night, cash in hand, we drop you back wherever. Terrence saw me first, and his face did something. He sat back. The man turned around and gave me a smile that was too fast. "Hey there," he said. "We're doing some outreach." "For who?" We work with a few different groups. Just checking in, seeing if anybody's looking for some short-term work." "What kind of work?" "Day labor stuff, warehouse, moving, whatever people want." I asked for a business card. He patted his jacket like he was looking for one and said he'd left them in the car. The woman had drifted farther into the room and was crouched down next to another resident's chair, talking low. I watched her put a hand on his knee. He was nodding. I said, "You need to sign in at the front, both of you." Sure, the man said. He didn't move. The woman looked over. There was this second where they made eye contact across the room, and something passed between them that I didn't like. Then she stood up, smoothed her coat, and started walking, but not toward my desk, toward the door to the hallway where the beds were. I said louder, "Ma'am, front desk, now." She stopped. Half the room was looking at us by then. On the TV, somebody scored and the crowd noise came through the speakers, and it was strange, that stadium roar in a room full of people who had nowhere else to be. Down the hall, I could see one of our guys, an older man everybody called Pop, standing by his bunk pulling on his coat. His duffel was already on the bed. He'd been getting ready to leave with them. He hadn't even packed. He was just going, and Pop was 71 years old and had a heart condition, and the wind chill outside was in the single digits. I said, "Pop, hang on a second, okay?" Pop looked at me. He looked at the woman. He said, "They said $100. "For what?" "Just riding along somewhere, helping load a truck." "Where?" He didn't know. He looked at the woman like she was going to answer for him, and she gave him this little apologetic shrug, like I was the one being unreasonable. I turned to the man. I kept my voice normal. I'd done this enough by then to know that if you get loud, everybody else gets loud, and then it's a scene, and scenes are how people get hurt. "I need to see accreditation," I said. "Any partner organization working with our residents has to be registered with the shelter. If you don't have it on you, that's fine, but you can't be in the building tonight. You're welcome to email our director in the morning." He said, "We're just talking to people." I said, "I understand, and I'm asking you to leave." He looked at me for a beat too long. Not angry, evaluating, like he was running the numbers on how much of a problem I was going to be. I'm 5'4", and I weigh about 130 pounds, and I know exactly what that math looks like from the other side. Then he smiled again, the same fast smile, and he said, "No problem. Sorry for the confusion." They left, both of them, together, out through the front door and into the parking lot. I stood at the glass and watched them get into a car that had been idling with its lights off across the street, dark sedan. I couldn't read the plate from where I was, and I didn't want to go outside to try. I went back inside and locked the door, which we don't usually do until midnight, and I went and sat down next to Pop on his bunk. I didn't lecture him. That was the one thing I promised myself in the 20 seconds it took to walk down the hall. He was a grown man, and he'd survived longer than most people I knew, and he did not need me talking down to him. I said, "Pop, I have to tell you something, and I want you to hear me out." He said, "I know what you're gonna say." "Do you?" He was quiet for a while. He was looking at his hands. His hands were shaking a little, not from fear, just from being 71 and cold. He said, "You think they were bad news?" I said, "I think that when somebody won't tell you where you're going, and won't tell you what you're doing, and won't give you a phone number, and won't sign in at the desk, it's usually because there's a reason they can't. And that reason is almost never good for the person getting in the car." He nodded slow. I told him what I'd been trained to say, and what I actually believed, which was that people who come into shelters offering cash for vague overnight work are usually looking for one of a few things, and none of those things end with the worker getting a ride home in the morning. I didn't get graphic. I didn't need to. Pop had lived a lot of life, and he filled in the blanks himself. He said, $100 though. I said, "I know." I talked to the two other guys they'd been leaning on. Same conversation. One of them was pissed at me for a while, and I let him be pissed. Pissed is fine. Pissed is alive and in the building. Around 1 in the morning, I called the county hotline for trafficking tips. I gave them everything I could remember. 2 people, approximate ages, what they'd been wearing, the make of the car, if not the plate, the direction they'd driven off in, the pitch they'd used, the names of the residents they'd talked to in case anyone needed to follow up. The woman on the phone was kind and thorough and didn't rush me and asked good questions, and at the end she said, "You did the right thing calling," in a voice that suggested she took a lot of these calls. I want to be honest about what happened after, because I think the temptation is to make it into a bigger story than it was. The tip line called me back 2 days later. They said the description matched a pair they'd been getting reports on from a couple other counties. They didn't tell me more than that, and I didn't ask. Some weeks after, I heard through my director that there had been arrests out near Youngstown involving a labor scheme that fed into something worse further down the line. I don't know if it was the same too. I have no way of knowing. I want to say it was, and I won't. What I know is that Pop slept in his bunk that night and ate breakfast in the morning and complained about the eggs, which he always did, and that the other 2 guys stayed too. That's the whole thing. Nobody got in a car. Nobody went to a warehouse that wasn't a warehouse. The worst that happened in our building that night was that the coffee was bad and the wind was loud, and somebody I'll never see again smiled at me twice. I still work nights. Different building now, same city. When somebody walks in with their own clipboard, I get up from the desk before they get past the community board. It's a small thing. A lot of it is small things. I still volunteer at that shelter. That's the part I want to say first, because otherwise, this story sounds like it's building to something worse than it is. Winter of 2022, I was 23 and living in Rogers Park, working a mediocre office job and looking for a way to feel less useless. A friend told me about a place off Wilson Avenue that ran an overnight warming program, December through March. They needed hands. I signed up. The shelter was in the basement of a church, low ceilings, fluorescent lights that hummed if you stood under them too long. Cots pushed close together, industrial coffee urn in the corner, that particular smell of wet coats and instant oatmeal that I still associate with those months. We opened at 7, closed at 7. Volunteers worked in shifts of 3, usually, sometimes 4. Chicago was mean that year. The wind off the lake would find you through 2 layers. I noticed him the first night. He was probably 6'5", broad, mid-50s. Gray beard grown out unevenly. He sat on the same cot every evening, back against the cinderblock wall, and he watched. Not the TV in the corner, not the intake table, not the other men. He watched me. Every time I turned around, he was already looking. He never spoke. Not when I asked if he wanted coffee, not when I handed him a towel. He'd give a small nod, take the thing, and go back to his cot. And keep watching. The other volunteers didn't seem to register him. Rachel, who'd been doing this for 6 winters, told me his name was Marcus and that he'd been coming in on and off since November. "Quiet one," she said, and shrugged, like that was the whole file. By my 3rd shift, I was avoiding him. If I had to hand out blankets, I did his row last. If I was pouring coffee, I let someone else take his cup down. Not because he'd done anything. He hadn't done anything. He just sat there, big hands on his knees, and looked at me. I started building a story in my head. He was watching me because he was picking a target. He was memorizing my face. When I left at 7 in the morning, he'd be on the same block, waiting. I lived a mile from the shelter. Walked home in the dark half the time. I mentioned him once to my roommate, not as a real complaint, more the way you mention something so it exists outside your own head. She said, "Just tell them you don't want to work when he's there," which felt embarrassing to say out loud to Rachel, who'd worked with people way rougher than Marcus and never blinked. So I kept coming, and I kept watching him watch me. Second week of December, we had a bad night. Wind chill was somewhere around -15. Every cot was full by 7:30, and we had guys sitting on folding chairs along the back wall because we couldn't turn anyone away in that weather. The floor was slushy from boots. Someone had a cough that sounded wet. Rachel was running around trying to get the boiler tech on the phone because half the radiators had gone lukewarm. Around 1 in the morning, Rachel took Danny, the other volunteer, and went upstairs to look at the fuse box in the hallway with a maintenance guy who'd finally shown up. She told me she'd be 20 minutes. She was gone almost an hour. Most of the room was asleep by then. Snoring, the shift of bodies on old cots, the radiator finally clicking back on somewhere. I was at the intake table filling out the logbook, trying to remember which guys had signed in after 11. My back was to the room. I heard the cot creak. I knew which cot. You know that sound after enough nights. The specific way each one gives. It was his. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the log. I could hear his boots on the concrete. Slow, deliberate, not sneaking, but not casual. He was walking toward the intake table. I want to tell you that I stayed calm. I didn't. My hand was on the pen, and the pen was shaking. I was doing math in my head about how far the front door was, and whether the deadbolt was thrown. I was thinking about my phone in my back pocket and whether I could pull it out without him seeing. The footsteps stopped behind me. Close. I could hear him breathing, that heavy nose breathing of a big man who's been sitting still for hours. "Miss." His voice was low and thick, like he hadn't used it in a while. I turned around slow. He was right there, maybe 3 feet away, bigger up close than I'd let myself register from across a room. Snow still on the shoulders of his coat from earlier. He was holding something out to me, in his palm. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. A ceramic mug, the one I'd been drinking tea from earlier before the shift got busy. I'd set it on the edge of the intake table, and I guess I'd knocked it off with my elbow at some point without noticing. "You dropped this," he said, "when you turned around. I didn't want you to step on it." He set it down on the table, very carefully, handle facing me. Then he turned around and walked back to his cot, sat down, back against the wall, hands on his knees. I stood there with a ceramic mug in front of me, and I did not move for a long time. The mug wasn't broken. He must have caught it, or picked the pieces up. I checked later, there wasn't a chip. He'd crossed the room to give me back a mug, and to tell me he'd caught it so I wouldn't step on the shards in my sneakers. Rachel came back a few minutes later, complaining about the fuse box. I didn't tell her anything. I finished the shift. Walked home at 7 in a gray dawn, wind still cutting, and I sat on my kitchen floor with my coat on and cried for about 10 minutes, and I couldn't have told you exactly why. I kept coming to the shelter. That was the important part, I think. I kept coming, and I kept doing his row last, but I started actually looking at him when I handed him coffee, and after a couple weeks he started nodding at me before I nodded at him. Rachel was the one who told me the rest a few weeks later, over bad coffee in the church kitchen. She'd known him longer. His wife had gotten sick a few years back, some long thing, cancer that came back twice. He'd cashed out his retirement, then the house, then whatever was left. She died in the spring of 2021. He hadn't really worked since. Rachel said he'd been a middle school teacher for almost 30 years, out in Berwyn. Social studies, I think, or maybe history. He doesn't talk much because it's hard for him, Rachel said. It's not shyness exactly. He told me once it hurts, like the words don't come up right anymore. I asked her about the watching, about how he stared at me. She looked at me for a second, like she was deciding something, and then she laughed a little, not unkind. "Honey," she said, "the man taught 8th graders for 30 years. He watches everyone. He watches the door, he watches who's fighting, he watches who looks sick. He was probably making sure nobody bothered you at the intake table. It's a habit, that's all it is." I didn't say anything. I don't remember what I did with my face. I want to be careful here, because I know how this sounds. I'm not saying every guy who stares at a woman in a room is secretly a saint. That's not the lesson. There are men to be afraid of, and my body is allowed to tell me about them. What I'm saying is that for 3 weeks, I built a person out of nothing. I took a big quiet man with sad eyes, and I gave him a plan and a motive and a whole future crime. I wrote a whole story about him in my head, and I made myself the main character of it, and I never once wondered what his story was. Not until after he handed me back my mug. He kept coming to the shelter through February. Then one week, he didn't show up, and the week after that either. Rachel said he'd gotten into a transitional housing program out in Cicero. She had the address written down somewhere in case we needed to forward mail. I never wrote to him. I thought about it a lot. I couldn't figure out how to start a letter to someone who probably never knew I'd been afraid of him without making the letter about me instead of him, so I didn't send anything. That might have been the wrong call. I still don't know. The shelter closed at the end of March, like it does every year. I signed up again the next winter, and the winter after that. I still work the intake table sometimes, and every time somebody big and quiet sits down against the back wall and watches the room, I remember that mug. The very careful way he set it down on the table, handle facing me, so I wouldn't have to reach. I've been taking calls for psychiatric emergency services in Dallas for almost 4 years, and I can count on one hand the nights that still bother me. April 2022 sits at the top of that list, and I don't think anything is going to knock it off. The center sits in a low brick building off Stemmons Freeway, 2nd floor, no windows on our side. We work in pods of 4, but on graveyard, it's usually just me and one other dispatcher, sometimes a supervisor if we're lucky. That night, it was me and a woman named Rhonda, who mostly handled the medical overflow line. She'd brought in a Tupperware of leftover King Ranch chicken, and the whole floor smelled like it. My shift started at 10. I remember because I'd just logged in and was still adjusting my headset when the first call came through. Not a 911 rollover, not a hospital line. It came in on our non-emergency intake, the number families call when they want to talk to somebody before things get bad. The guy was quiet, not whispering, but quiet, like he was in a room where somebody else was asleep. "You're going to take 6 calls tonight," he said. "The first one is coming in 20 minutes. Write this down." I almost hung up right there. We get people playing games sometimes, bored kids, drunks, people who don't know what number they dialed. I keep a form open for anything that sounds off, so I put my cursor in the notes field and said, "Sir, can you tell me what's going on?" He gave me an address, Old East Dallas, off Junia Street, house number and all. Then he said, 20 minutes, and the line went dead. I sat there with my hand on the mouse. Rhonda glanced over from her pod, chewing, and asked if it was a good one. I said probably a prank. I typed up the notes anyway, because that's just what you do, and I flagged it as suspicious. Then I got up and made coffee. At 10:22, the intake line lit up. It was a woman crying, saying her brother had locked himself in the bathroom and wasn't answering her. She could hear him going through the medicine cabinet. I ran through the script. I got mobile crisis rolling. I stayed with her until the team arrived. When I pulled up the address to log the dispatch, my stomach did something I can't describe. Junia Street, same house number, down to the digit, I told Rhonda. She said addresses repeat all the time. That whole neighborhoods off Junius are full of tiny lots stacked on top of each other, and I probably remembered wrong. I pulled the notes from the quiet caller. Same address, not close, exact. The second call from him came at 11:15. Second one is in an hour. You ready? His voice was the same low, careful voice, like he was reading off a page. I asked him who this was. I asked him how he knew what had just happened. He didn't answer either question. He gave me an address in Pleasant Grove, apartment number included, and told me to write it down. Then he was gone. I walked the note over to Rhonda's pod and put it in front of her. She read it twice. She said, "Okay, so somebody's messing with you. Let it play." She reached for her phone and called our supervisor. He was at another facility that night and told her to document everything and loop in Dallas PD if a second address hit. At 12:14, a call came in from a neighbor in a Pleasant Grove apartment complex. A woman 2 doors down was pounding on his door saying somebody was inside her walls. She was off her medication, had been for weeks, and her sister had been trying to get her help. The neighbor was scared for her. The address matched, apartment number and all. I want to say I stayed calm. I want to say I did my job like I was trained. What I actually did was finish the call, mute my line, walk to the bathroom, and stand at the sink for maybe 2 minutes with the water running. I didn't cry, I just watched the water. Then I went back and picked up my headset, because that's what I get paid for. The third call from him came at 1:03. He didn't say hello, he said the address, said about 90 minutes, and hung up. This time I typed while he was still talking. Oak Cliff, a street I actually know, near where an old coworker used to live. I called Dallas PD directly. I gave the sergeant on the line a summary. He asked me to send everything I had, and he said he'd have a unit sit near the address as a precaution. At 2:31, a call came from that street. A father who couldn't get his teenage daughter to open her bedroom door. She'd been getting worse for months. He said she'd been in there for 6 hours, and he could hear her talking to somebody who wasn't there. I told him a unit was already in the area. I stayed with him until the officers made contact. She was alive. She was not okay, but she was alive. I remember standing up after that call and feeling like my legs weren't mine. The fourth call from the man came at 3:40. He sounded exactly the same. Not tired, not excited. Same reading voice. He gave me an address in Lake Highlands and said, 40 minutes. I asked him if he was watching these people. I asked him if he was the one making this happen. He waited long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, I'm just telling you what's going to happen. That's all I do. He hung up. At 4:20, a woman called from Lake Highlands. Her husband had come home from a night shift, gone into the garage, and hadn't come back inside. She'd found him sitting in the car with the door open, not answering her, staring at the wall. She said the gun safe in the corner was open. Nothing was missing yet. The officers got there in 6 minutes. I logged the call, hands shaking so bad I typed the street name 3 different ways before I got it right. The 5th warning came at 5:02, Frisco this time, which is well outside our normal footprint, but our line covers the whole metro on Graveyard. He gave me the address, said 30 minutes, and this time he added something new. One more after this one, then you're done. I said, please stop calling me. I don't know why, it just came out. He didn't respond. The line clicked off the way he always ended them, no goodbye, no breath. The 5th real call came at 5:28. A grandmother in Frisco whose grandson had shown up at her door in the middle of the night, asking if he could sleep on her couch. She'd gotten him inside, gotten him a glass of water, and called us because she didn't know what else to do. He was calm on the phone when I spoke to him. He asked me if I liked my job. I told him I did, most nights. The 6th warning came at 6:11. The sky outside the parking lot was starting to change color. I could see it through the glass door at the end of our hallway when the call rolled in. He gave me an address in Garland. He said, last one. 20 minutes. I asked him one more time who he was. I asked him why he was doing this. He was quiet for a while, then he said, you did good tonight, and he hung up. That one landed different than the others. It didn't sound like a threat, it sounded like somebody closing a book. At 6:33, a call came in from a Garland address, a young man asking, in a very flat voice, whether it was okay to want to stop feeling anything. He wouldn't give me his name at first. He gave me the street when I asked. Same street, same house. I kept him on the phone for 41 minutes. Mobile Crisis got there. He opened the door for them. My shift ended at 7. I stayed until 9, giving statements to 2 Dallas PD detectives and a woman from the FBI's local field office, who happened to be in the building for something unrelated. I gave them the recordings, the logs, the exact times. I drove home in full daylight and slept for maybe 2 hours before I woke up staring at the ceiling. They traced the calls over the next few weeks. Every warning came from a different burner phone, purchased with cash at gas stations across 5 different counties, 2 from a Circle K in Mesquite. 1 from a truck stop off I-20. The phones themselves were never recovered. Whoever bought them knew where the cameras pointed. The psychiatrists I ended up talking to, both mine and one the department brought in, floated a theory, organized group, multiple people. Somebody who had access to case notes or intake histories, maybe a former social worker, maybe a pharmacy tech, maybe a family member who'd sat in enough waiting rooms to memorize names. The idea was that they were staging something, a demonstration maybe, a message. Nobody could agree on to whom, but the calls weren't staged. That was the part that stuck. Every single one of those 6 people was in real crisis. Real families, real diagnoses on file, most of them years old. The man on the phone hadn't invented anything. He'd known. That's the piece I keep coming back to. Not how he knew where they lived. Anybody with enough time and enough patience can find an address. What I don't understand is how he knew that particular night was going to be their night. How he knew, hours ahead, that a woman in Pleasant Grove was going to lose it at the exact minute she lost it. How he knew a kid in Garland was going to reach for the phone at 6:30. The detectives asked me if I'd ever heard his voice before. I hadn't. They played me clips of a few people they were looking at. None of them matched. The calls stopped. Not tapered off, not moved to a different dispatcher. Stopped. I worked Graveyard for another 8 months, and the intake line never lit up like that again. I still take shifts. I still put my headset on at 10. Every now and then, when the line rings before I've even finished logging in, I sit there for a second before I answer. Just a second. Then I pick up because somebody on the other end needs me to.